Hey, Anzer, how's it going?
Good. I think we're
Good.
live.
Yep, I think we're live. So, welcome back to our 10 stages of supply chain maturity journey that we're taking you through to walk you through pretty much all the technologies that exist and capabilities in the market. Today, we wanted to talk about ontology, right? So, it's a hot topic. A lot of chatter around, hey, if you don't use ontology or don't invest in ontology first, how are you going to get the AI models to work? So this lecture, the sixth lecture, Stage 6, is going to be based around that. So what I wanted to do for the audience that's joining in that hasn't attended the previous 5 to 6 lectures, right, is just set the stage again, right? So what we're trying to do is convince a lot of people that there's a lot going on, but the ultimate goal is throughput. And to get there, we spoke about spreadsheets in stage 1, and we talked about cons, how most people still operate in that environment. Like, how can we get to it? And then last week we spoke extensively on agentic AI, RPA, and what the capabilities are there. So this week we're going to talk about ontology, right? The picture I basically created using Copilot from Microsoft was, hey, it's basically after the block party when you actually meet the cool kids and you basically drive out with them. That's basically what I think ontology is right now in the market, right? It's just there's a niche that really believes in it. We obviously see the purpose, but like many other things, there are pros, cons, limitations, constraints. So, like the last few lectures, we're going to talk about the situation, our experience with our customers. So, we do work downstream of, say, like a Palantir. We have been approached by Microsoft previously to push Fabric, though we said, hey, we can't. How to get back on that throughput highway, right? Even without investing in these sorts of things, or if you already did, how to get back regardless, right? Because sometimes you make decisions, right? ERP, IBP, the IT team has decided on the operating system. They want you to move towards it. But there are obviously consequences of staying that path. And again, I mentioned some of the technologies on the ontology side. They're not the only vendors. More and more pop up every day. So why don't we start with just the situation? So Anzar, explain to me, first of all, what ontology is, because this is a term that is still very new, at least in the operations world. Maybe in the tech side of things, ontology has been around for at least 20 years, if not more. So give me just a brief definition on ontology.
Well, thanks for asking, Ollie. So I've been hearing ontology since my research days in 2017 in AI labs. Um, in the enterprise space, it's come around in the last 3 years, especially as you mentioned through Palantir. Again, if you want to really trace the words, back for ontology, it just goes to philosophy. But as far as computer science, electrical engineering, it's to try and define those sort of relationships between how data is stored in different tables and structures. Theoretically, it makes sense in terms of why you would need ontology, simply based on how most systems exist and where the data is stored. But there's always a difference between theory and practice. I think in the last 3 years, it's mostly been a marketing push in terms of what we mentioned previously, right? In our previous stages around connecting the dots, when we're talking about giving those agents some sort of context to your systems, to your at least your information systems, ontology makes sense. Now, the investment into ontology, that's debatable.
Yeah, and on that note, right? So what I found is if you apply ontology efforts on big systems with lots of expensive assets tied to it, obviously you're going to get an ROI, but you're going to get an ROI with BI for that matter, right? So if the premise is, oh, the data is so dirty and not clean and connected to begin with, anything you do to that, right, is a leap frog effect in terms of, or a step change in terms of what you can achieve from an ROI perspective, right? So it's more of like consolidating the data and bringing it together that's providing the efficiency gains. But when you start scaling it down into small businesses, the unit economics start very much not failing, but the payout the payout time, right, it ends up being many, many, many years out, right? So if you look at an ontology as a capital expenditure versus like an OpEx expenditure, which I guess that was the case with AI as well, maybe it makes sense that, hey, in the long term, if we get everything available and mapped in this big web, it'll be more retrievable. But then again, talk to me about that piece of data engineering, right? What is going on? Why do you need ontology? Why can't you just do basic data engineering?
Yeah, so some of the earlier systems we mentioned, as far as those ERP and those functional solutions, they were designed with a specific use case in mind, and I feel like we're repeating the same thing with these, efforts around ontology. Because at the end of the day, as you mentioned, the reason to do that is to make sense of that information and that sort of data. But I feel like people have been approaching it from a left to right concept where you're designing an ideal theoretical scenario that's disconnected from actual workflows and how operations run versus, let's say, how we claim that we're more right to left in terms of giving that sort of agency back to operations and giving that flexibility. So ontology at the end of the day is meant to provide that sort of flexibility, to be able to repersist data across different systems, to be able to manage it dynamically rather than have it go stale in ERP. So that's the reasoning behind it. But at the end of the day, it's also just becoming just another generation of, let's say, an ERP system where it becomes a representation of your reality. And when we're talking about information systems and computer science, it all makes sense. If we go back to, let's say, electrical engineering and systems where both the sensors and the actuators are under your control and already automated, it would definitely make sense to have that layer in place. But we are talking right now from the perspective of where the world is right now and what we've seen in organizations, and rushing into these sort of pie in the sky concepts on the hopes of automation while your business is, it essentially just becomes a really, really big expense for your business, especially if you just don't have that much capital to throw around.
Yeah, and on that note, let's talk about our customers, right? So maybe I start there because I have a little bit more experience working in this space than you have exposure to, right? So, like yourself, for many, many years, I always wondered what is this like magic secret system that is able to,
Yep.
track everything, do everything, etc., right? But so far, my experience has been that the problem has been, yes, if everything was in one spot and you had the whole ISORAN thing going on where you could see everything, okay, you can retrieve all the information in repository, but is that the one system to flow them all? Maybe it's the one system to rule them all, right? But that has been sort of the disconnect that I've seen, right? So almost everywhere we've gone, it's been like, okay, yeah, it's already in the ontology system, just go pull in the data. And it's really not. Maybe the workflows on the IT side are probably all getting migrated there, and that makes a lot of sense, right? But then when you actually look at the physical workflows, right, that's where the disconnect is. So this is the difference between investing in an operating system and a production system. And we'll probably talk about that at the end of our lecture, which is, hey, did we really make $1 trillion mistake in terms of maybe multi-trillion dollar mistake in terms of funding more and more AI operating systems, ontology operating systems, whatever it is. I won't go into that right now because that is probably will be the end realization of this entire series. But what we've seen is customers will say everything's in there, go pull it out. Our team gets in there and it's not, right? Because the physical world does not exist inside of this digital world. It can potentially, I don't think it'll ever exist fully in the ontology realm, right? That's how I look at it. And so I've seen the discrepancies myself, right? Where at the top, it might be showing we have X amount, but when you look at the bottom physically, you don't have that, right? So talk to me about data refresh, right? Which is the other piece, which is, yeah, you can bring all this together, but if the data is not syncing fast enough, then how do you even know you have the inventory you claim you to have, right?
Okay, let me qualify by saying that the concepts are sound in terms of what people are trying to accomplish. It's just the implementation and the reality is a bit different because what I see, for example, with some of the big ontology players is they're repeating this same SAP, legacy supply chain vendor playbook, as in they're creating system lock-in and it's very centralized. And as you correctly mentioned, the data does not sync because it's very, very heavily centralized, I would say. And the way that these systems are being designed, again, I'm going back to my research days in 2017, are really disconnected from the actual operational workflows, how the work actually happens, how the information is processed. And at the end of the day, the people designing these systems are also, human beings. And if they have zero idea of how the actual physics and how work or material flows, this is what you end up with. You're designing, for spec rather than the realities of the world. And yeah, if the data is not synced, what you're showing in your digital system is just completely disconnected from the reality. But operations needs, we're talking about supply chain, right? So we're talking about truck moves, we're talking about loads, we're talking about if the inventory is actually there or not. If the data is not in sync and you're creating these massive systems and then running AI on top of it, you're just causing more problems down the line.
And this brings us to the next topic, obviously, of okay, how do you bridge the gap between the physical world and this one day it'll all be in that system world, right? So, talk to me about the forward deployed engineer, right? So, this is not a new concept. This
Mm-hmm.
is, I think, more of a new term, right? What exactly does a FDE do for these sorts of operations?
I mean, we've had field engineers before forward deployed engineers. There seems to be a popular theory that it seems it's easier to get a math brain tech person and teach them operations rather than the other way around. Um, Debatable, I would say, but that's essentially what a lot of organizations that are pushing towards data and AI are doing. They start people off in the warehouses, and that's a very effective approach. But what the FDE essentially does is, from a software perspective, they're just essentially doing the customization that based on that existing architecture, which could be, giant, they're trying to make these customizations to have it fit to the operations. We've always been the other way around, where we try to fit, for example, our math to the operational realities and the data maturity. But yeah, it's just the final, tuning and customization. It's admirable work, but I'm not so, let's say, convinced by this model.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to any of the IT or the data types, they're like, look how retrievable it is. We couldn't get the data fast enough, which is great, right? But again, that's a computer science problem that you're solving
Yep.
for yourself in the back office. It's not an operations problem that you're solving for the front lines, right? So there's a lot of talk about, yeah, like, this is helpful, and now we're doing it 1,000 times faster. But is the material actually flowing 1,000 times faster? And that's the big question nobody wants to talk about, right? The information is flowing thousands of times faster because now you click a button and it's retrievable. So previously it was not even retrievable, right? So this comes back to the question of, do you want to build an information repository, which seems to be the utopian state of a lot of CIOs, right? Which is I click a button, or a CFO, and I click a button, I can find anything. Or do you want to create a system that improves flow in the overall operations, right? So what you're seeing right now is there are shortages of parts. There are shortages on data centers. There are shortages on all sorts of things, foods. A lot of these large organizations use ontology systems, right? So if production has really sped up 600x, why are we not seeing 600x more inventory showing up to the endpoint, right? And this seems to be the big disconnect that I feel is not honestly covered in the ecosystem.
Yep.
But for those of us who sit and see it every day, and I still have an independent voice still for the most part, right? Because I'm not funded by anyone that is institutional. This seems to be like the big opportunity, I would say, right? Where whoever figures out that the silver bullet is not an operating system or ontology system, and it's actually doing something else and getting back to focus on producing faster and going back to systems thinking and rethinking everything from a overall output perspective, that country is going to win. Period. They're going to win in reindustrialization. They're going to win. They're basically the next giant superpower. Now, the last group that actually has effectively done this, right, has been China, right, where they actually said, okay, automation, AI, computer vision, amazing stuff. But how do we figure out our processes first and capacity to basically copy anything from, I don't know, big Happy Meal toys to fighter jets, right? That the U.S. produces, right? So speak to me on that, right? It's just your point, right? The focus is being let's get a bunch of smart people who, for the most part, are not even engineers onto this ontology thing. Some of them know computer science. Versus let's get the mechanical, chemical engineer, industrial guys who actually spend time in the field to rethink, okay, if we were to build and augment our production system with an AI system, ontology system, what would that look like? So speak to me on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the approach, right? On one side, we're talking about computer science, theoretical, perfect utopia world where everything is going to be automated anyway with physical AI, and we're chasing that vision. Versus this is the outcome or the end goal that we want, and what do we need to design to support that? And I think, as you mentioned, China has been a bit better with this, uh, and there's even better approaches than that, and we'll talk about it. It's simply from the perspective that this is what we want to do. This is our operational end goal. They don't degrade those operational capabilities, and they supplement that with effective use of technology. But they have the people and process in place. The people have agency. While what I've been seeing in the flip side is we're designing systems very centralized from some back office ivory tower, and we're hoping that the people will adjust. We'll redesign the workflows to fit that ideal system while the whole world keeps moving. And I think that's been very damaging.
I'm glad you brought up agency, right? So there's obviously people agency and then whatever everybody talks about right now with agents, right? So speak to me on how throughput can help, right? So I'm just reading through like
Yeah.
our journey stage 6. So one of the things I mentioned was while the ontology systems can provide the context between the different data sets to your agentic workflows, you still need the right tools and computational logic for your agents to call, right? I think maybe that was actually your line, which I actually like. But speak to me on what throughput can help with, right? So we're claiming, oh, it's the one system to flow them all. I think that's a bit of a stretch, to be honest, as well. We can do a lot of cleaning up stuff internally to make the flow improve internally. But obviously, we can get augmentation from even other vendors who do deal with the tier ends and are able to synchronize lead times upstream, as well as better demand signal, which we should not be cleaning up, but we are, right? So speak to me on like what does throughput do, right? Because ontology is the greatest thing since sliced bread right now. If you look at the commercial revenues and how some of these companies are doing on that side, they would say, okay, this is the proof point. But tell me why that is not the proof point, right? Why isn't 90% margin on some of these businesses the solution? Because anytime you ask tech, right, as a okay, is this really working? They just point to the stock price or just point to like the
Yeah.
valuation, right? So speak to me more on like how does throughput help?
I mean, we can just have them talk to our customers that are also undergoing, let's say, Palantir or Fabric as their ontology layer and what we help them solve. At the end of the day, we're focused on improving material flow. We end up having to work around these systems and work with these systems just to get the right information, but we usually work on very targeted data. And even if you are able to connect all these systems and provide the context for your agents, you still need some sort of operational logic, and you just can't infer that sort of operational logic just from mass internet trained data. Again, it'll go back to the AI stuff where even let's say Alex Karp has mentioned that these frontier models aren't actually creating value in enterprises, simply because they don't have the ability to do math and reason, regardless of what anyone might say. So simple targeted data use cases that are focused on bottlenecks and material flows, that's what we do. And that actually touches your operational capacity. The way I would frame it is that we're that right to left system where we work with the people actually in charge of operations or in charge of the material flow and give them some agency back. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we tend to put the people in charge, whereas these like ontology systems are centralizing everything, bringing it on, put the top in charge. Now, in financial systems, maybe that makes sense, right? But in active zones where you actually need people to be able to make decentralized decisions, is this the best solution out there? I would make the case probably not, right? But again, it's being
Yep.
pushed, and that's what it is because obviously there's taxpayer dollars that are tied from the top to the bottom to see how that's flowing. But let's talk about the consequences of staying on this road, right? Because the next step for a lot of the people who go through AI and agents and they realize, oh well, yeah, this is not working. I can't just plug everything into Anthropic, or I can't just train my codex from OpenAI on everything because there's so many rules. What are the consequences of saying, you know what, the next step is ontology? So we've tried ERP, we tried IBP, we tried all the LLMs, what are the consequences of saying, yeah, we're going to double down? We invested hundreds of millions of dollars, right, into IBP and ERP and now Ontology. I mean, what ends up happening if they just say, you know what, we're going to make it work, regardless of other things being out there that can actually get the systems more throughput?
What are the consequences? Just like a sunk cost, hoping that that vision comes real in 5, 10 years. We have all these vision 2030s, 2050s. Has anyone ever gone back and checked if they're able to hit those milestones or if they're able to actually improve their uh, I mean, I don't want to quote companies, but I know all these people in 2017, 2018 that were pitching this, and then you could just look at their actual performance and stock price a few years down the line, um, their actual cash flow and income. Regarding consequences, I mean, you're just tying up money for this future vision while your people in operations are suffering because, as we spoke about earlier, most of these systems end up in the hands of the analysts. They end up in the hands of the IT back office people, or let's say your consultants or your forward deployed engineers, but never actually make it to the operations end users. And you want to give them agency because you're never going to have perfect data, right? Maybe China could have that because of the way that their society is designed, but you can't have like full-on surveillance data every millisecond about everything. You need people that have those operational capabilities to make those decisions in the face of information uncertainty. And we're building a very fragile system if we're going to imagine that some centralized system will do everything and AI will catch up.
And on that note, right, I'm just looking at some of our notes on consequences of staying on the road. So, talk to me about like who convinced who on this whole digital twin and having hundreds of use cases and analytics use cases, right? How was that a value sell?
I mean, the way that I see it in organizations is, you know, you can solve a very specific targeted use case that creates a lot of impact for your business, but I've had IT push back on that because it doesn't work with their future data structure, which always ends up being aspirational, something that they've been working on for 10 years. That's my problems with Ontology, which is that we need a perfect data structure that will support future use cases while your business is sinking. So considering what's happening right now, like, in a lot of parts of the world, you, like I don't understand the logic or the finance behind somehow this will pay off in 10 years versus, fixing what needs to be fixed right now and improving throughput.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the catfish and the roaches will come out and basically, restart civilization afterwards. But I'm just looking at my notes, right? Which is, again, you're finally getting to a stage where you need to prioritize the application layer and show actual returns, but you can't because the system doesn't prioritize flow, right? So I think that's the biggest problem that I'm seeing. And again, claims can be made, but from my side, I think it's more visual data layer that once everything is connected, you can see it, they can make decisions, right? But in terms of better visibility, flexibility, yes, you can get that, but does the data ever exist in one system? I have not seen it in the real world yet. There's always some data set that comes out of left field that throws everything off. I mean, this is the same problem as all the other stages. So it's great for data science projects, in my opinion, but Ontology doesn't really impact, in my opinion, operational flow at a holistic level, right? Even though it's supposed to be pulling all the data together and say it's not. It's even if it's 600 times faster, you're not getting 600 times more output. And I think that's where there's this disconnect about, okay, like building a system repository and better search engine and being able to find an answer faster is not the same as moving something across, the, I don't know, say the Panama Canal faster, right? Just because we've done some optimization projects down there. So just because we can show 15% more throughput doesn't mean that the ships are going to have like 15% more ships going at a faster rate, right? They still have to flow at that same rate because their engines are not going to suddenly go 100 miles an hour faster. Actually, they are knots, but they're not going to go a few knots faster because suddenly we have more efficiencies, right? So speak to me on that, right? Which is that Yeah, information retrieving that's great. It's like going from like dial-up to fiber optic to now Starlink and all that stuff. But speak to me on the physical side of things. So obviously we're like not delivering stuff to the moon in like a second.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about information latency, but we're again talking about a very centralized system that does not work with external partners. You brought up the Panama Canal example, right? Like being able to get more throughput is by focusing on the choke point, which would be the locks and the scheduling around the ships and the prioritization. So we see, for example, right now people paying what, like $5 million for the fast pass just for one ship.
Yeah.
China, and that's worrying because they obviously are able to prioritize better than we are. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, what else is there to say, right? Like we're pitching this perfect utopian vision where once we have the right information, we'll make the right decisions. But that does not seem to be the case. And again, all I see from most of these ontology plays is that it's the same enterprise, tech playbook where they're going to have lock-in. Um, some of the concepts within are useful when we're talking about, making the data structures more flexible to support multiple use cases, but the implementation has been lacking, and I think organizations are suffering. A lot of the organizations that we walk into, they're either ripping out these systems and trying to refocus back on operational capabilities. And yeah, I mean, those ones are the smart ones. The rest will end up going through this journey and spend 5 more years, building that perfect control tower.
Yeah, I mean, I've had CIOs of large industrial companies that have used C systems basically say, yeah, at least we know that we can't do ontology. So it was actually a success because it was a failure. Because it helped us like look back. And again, you can sell your board wherever you want. That's not my company. But my bottom line is very simple, right? Which is I like technology. I like operations. I want to have the perfect sync of technology and operations to create more throughput. I just can't do only IT
Yep.
and no impact to the bottom line or the front lines, right? I think people are seeing this now 10 years on, right? They invested in these systems that are basically holding them back, but at the same time, they're needed to retrieve the data. So as you know, even in our company, we have two sides of the story where there's people who love this agents and AI and ontology stuff, and they see the absolute need for it. But then there's also the more like, hey, people worked in the field and also understand tech and stuff and operations and pulling data. I mean, we've been doing this for almost, I'll say 15 years now. But that seems to be the disconnect, right? Which is this hybrid system. And in the middle, there's like this whole FDE thing going on to be the bridge between the IT and the operations guys. But I still don't see it, right, with Ontology as the operating system, right? In industrial environments. Now, let's make it very clear for intelligence gathering, for search engine stuff, information, I don't think there's a parallel or even an equivalent, right, to an ontology system. Makes sense, right, to me, if you're trying to, especially like, mass data between different organizations and see at a high level, like what information is happening at the top, right, from the top to get to a certain decision. Absolute use case, right? But not in supply chain and operations. I know a lot of money is being raised against this, and again, we can do that too, but this is the big disconnect that I see. So, any other parting thoughts on this? I know we're coming up on time. Next week, I guess we're going to go into the process analytics world, right? Which is okay. Let's look at where the bottlenecks are. What is the bottleneck? Oh, look at the bottleneck, right? Anyways, from your perspective on ontology, what are your parting thoughts?
I mean, there's good ideas behind it. I'm not sure that it justifies the extreme amount of spend in enterprise organizations. We have some partners, for example, Sandu Consulting. They have a much better approach that doesn't create this sort of vendor lock-in. It doesn't have this whole, enterprise procurement language around it. Yeah, we'll get to that as well, I guess.
Yep. So thank you all for listening to us on at least our views on ontology. Hopefully you got something out of this today. Join us next week when we start speaking about process analytics, process mining. So some of the big players there obviously are, I want to say Salonis, used to be Process Gold used to be around. What are the companies now? I haven't kept in touch with I mean, a lot of this stuff is open source as well now. That's another thing that nobody talks about. But what's out there in the process analytics world now?
I'm trying to remember. There's this group out of this German research institute, Fraunhofer. They basically have the same capabilities as Slowness without the, business lingo.
Yeah,
So
business. Yeah. So, anyways, bottom line, software is being democratized, right? That was the pitch 10, 15 years ago from Andreessen Horowitz. But for the most part, is it really impacting operations? I personally have not seen it at the scale that it can, right? Obviously, finding data, cleaning it up, etc., is very useful. But the question is, why is the output not more? Obviously, companies are very, very rich now, doing a lot of stuff on the data AI side, but we're not seeing more industrial output. Is basically the thing that I've seen. And maybe economists can basically disagree with me, right, and say, look how much the GDP has grown over the last 10 years, right? It's actually grown $20 trillion for that matter, if you look at some of World Economic Forum's numbers, right? But then the case can also be made that the Earth is a closed system. How can you have more output for a system that has limited resources to begin with that we're not really renewing, right? So join us next week, same time, and thank you all for your time. And if there are questions that popped up, we'll try to respond to them in the comments. Thanks.
thanks, everyone.